Hello, everyone, and welcome to the sixth session in our CEDAW Convention speaker series being hosted by Equality Bahamas. Over the past few months, we have been welcoming experts from the CEDAW Committee itself to join us and help us to better understand this convention, the Women's Bill of Rights. And we've been going step by step, article by article, to make it easier for us to digest the convention, what it says, what it does, how it's interpreted by the committee, and how we can better use it within our own context, particularly in the Bahamas, in our push for the protection and the expansion and fulfillment of women's human rights. Today, we have another special guest with us, and we're very fortunate to have our very own Bahamian attorney at law and member of the CEDAW Committee with us, Marian Bethel, who will introduce our speaker for this month and this Article 6.
Yes. All right. Well, good morning from the Bahamas and good evening in the Netherlands where Corinne is and other places in the world. I'm really pleased to be here to work through Article 6 with our audience and Equality Bahamas. And as always, I thank Equality Bahamas for this, I call it groundbreaking work that it's doing. Alicia, Lauren, thank you so much for the hard work that you do in Equality Bahamas in general, but also in helping to bring this public education and awareness about the convention to the Bahamas and our region and international parts of the world too. So I want to welcome especially Corinne Dettmeijer, who is my colleague on the CEDAW Committee. Corinne joined us in February 2021 last year, and you would think that she had been on this committee, for decades, given the kind of significant contribution that she has made in a very short space of time. Corinne hit the ground running with great, zest and just keenness, and not to mention the aptitude and the acumen and the expertise that she brings to this committee. It's just extraordinary. And to date, Corinne has helped us to really see our committee in very creative ways and the work that we do, and has really endeavored to push us to use different kinds of innovations to make our constructive dialogues in particular stronger, and our concluding observations, etc. Corinne and I have the great opportunity to sit with Corinne on the optional protocol of the CEDAW Committee. And the optional protocol is the complementary convention to the CEDAW Convention, which allows individual women from around the world to bring individual complaints or group complaints to the CEDAW Committee. So we act as a quasi-judicial body under the optional protocol. And so Corinne and I are two of 5 members that sit on this working group where we adjudicate the complaints. And so complaints can range from gender-based discrimination and gender-based violence. It can range from, we just recently did one on the right to same-sex relations in Singapore. The right to health, the right not to be violently treated in terms of, let's say, obstetric violence in regard to health. So it's a very broad range of complaints that come to us. And Corinne is actually the vice chair of this particular working group. So I just want to welcome Corinne to this session today and thank her so much for being here with us. So Corinne Dettmeijer was the Dutch National Rapporteur on Trafficking in Human Beings and Sexual Violence Against Children from 2006 till the end of 2017. From 1984 until 2014, she was a judge at the Court of The Hague in the Netherlands. In November 2020, she was appointed as an independent member of the CEDAW Committee. She's also a member of the Supervisory Board of Child Helpline International. She holds a position in several advisory or supervisory boards in NGOs committed to human rights. And in 2018, she held the prestigious Clevering Chair at Leiden University in the Netherlands. A huge warm welcome to you, Corinne, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, Thank you. First, thank you, Alicia, for inviting me. And I think it's great what you're doing to go by these articles one by one. And I'm really honored to be able to speak to you about Article 6. And thank you, Marion, also for, I'm sure, this invitation, and also for making my start at the CEDAW Committee easier. Marion says that I hit the ground running. Well, I must say that both Marion and I see Aruna Narayan has joined us. They together were my inspirators and gave me guidance on how the work within the committee was done. So thank you both very much, and you have been a great help to me. Now, Article 6 on human trafficking is it's a very interesting article. And I must say I think Alicia already said that, please feel free to ask me any question during my presentation if you so want. Article 6 on trafficking and prostitution is there from the beginning of our convention, and as such has been written down in an international convention long before any other convention dealt with this problem. The Palermo Protocol is from the year 2000, and the European conventions and the EU directive are even from a later date. So as such, the CEDAW Convention sets an example on the importance of fighting trafficking in women and girls particularly, but of course the way it's been worded and is part of the convention is aimed at women and girls, and yet trafficking is such a huge problem worldwide for both men and women that the explanation that the committee has given about trafficking during the years, both in its jurisprudence and in the general recommendations, sort of fills out the original convention, and thus also adds to the other conventions on this same topic. If we look at trafficking on a global scale, there used to be 3 Ps that were important: prevention, protection, and prosecution. So those were the main object that the fight against trafficking should entail, and those Ps have been added to by punishment, because you can prosecute what you want, but if there are acquittals all over, then that doesn't really well, it's just not enough, right? So the punishment should be there too. And then also the partnership, because fighting human trafficking is not something that one country does by its own. It needs the cooperation, sometimes with source countries, sometimes with police from other countries. So there needs to be a wider spread partnership, because traffickers don't really respect borders. And we see that in the whole global migration, that trafficking needs to be fighted against by all of us. Of course, I looked at how the Bahamas is doing in the global slavery index, and in the tip report. If I look at the global slavery index, what I see is that in the Bahamas there would be under 1,000 victims of trafficking. But then if I look a little closer at the global slavery index, I see that the data collection and the monitoring of trafficking is not really very well in place. So that does not say enough. If I look at the tip report, the Bahamas are in tier 1, which is good. And also there is a list of recommendations in the last in the last tip reports, and I will go over some of those recommendations that I think are really important. Of course, they all are important, but some are just a little bit more important than others. I already said the Palermo Protocol, and what the tip report looks at is whether or not the legislation of the country that they give the report on is in compliance with the Palermo Protocol, and the Bahamas is. But that's just the start, the legal work. If we look further to the Palermo Protocol, we see that it's really a part of the UNODC Convention on Fighting Crime, and the Palermo Protocol has the criminal's perspective, so to speak. It's the fighting the crime perspective, and not so much the victim. And although worldwide victims have become more and more a part of the fight against trafficking, we need the victims, we need their compliance, we need their help to fight trafficking. But the Palermo Protocol is basically a protocol to fight crime. Within the broader Europe, the European Convention of 2005, 5 years after the Palermo Protocol, looks much more at the perspective from the victim. And I know that the Warsaw Convention is, of course, not a convention that means anything, or no, I shouldn't say it like that. That is important for the Bahamas, but still, all these conventions are important for us at the CEDAW Committee to look at the way countries comply with Article 6. So it's not just the Palermo Protocol, we also look at the Warsaw Convention and also at the EU directive on trafficking. If I look at the recommendations from the TIP report, one of the important recommendations, or that I thought important, was the one on data collection. And data collection, why is it so important? What gets counted counts. If you can tell people how the scale of the problem is in your country, then that gets attention. I can give you an example of that. In 2017, together with UNODC, we did an estimate on trafficking victims in the Netherlands. Now, the estimate we did was specifically on Western countries, because there it was mostly based on data collection. The same estimate had been done also in Bangladesh, and there it's easier to ask people whether they know somebody who's been a victim of trafficking, and in that way come to a reliable estimate. But the way we did it was based on the data collection that I, as a rapporteur, was responsible for. And what we found was that we looked at the number of victims of trafficking per 100,000 of the population. And we particularly looked at the two groups that were the most predominant to become a victim of trafficking. And we found that in our estimate, 257 girls between the ages of 12 and 17 per 100,000 Dutch girls were victims of trafficking. Now, 257 on 100,000 is huge. What we also found was 311 of non-Dutch citizens were victims of trafficking. That too is huge. If we looked at it overall, we came to a much lesser figure, of course. But I used to talk about this number and comparing it to when we, for instance, talk about an epidemic. Of course, now with COVID, we do not really talk about epidemics anymore. We only talk about pandemics. But anyway, in the Netherlands, when 50 persons out of 100,000 get the flu, we call that flu an epidemic. And if you then tell them that 257 of the girls, of the 100,000 girls between 12 and 17 become victims, Dutch girls become victims of trafficking, that puts that number in a completely different perspective, and that sheds more light on it, and also more light on the importance of dealing with it. Many countries do not really look at domestic victims. They count victims from other countries, if they count at all, but to see that your own citizens from your, well, nationals from your own country become a victim of trafficking is in a way kind of alien. It's an alien thought. You tend to think of poor migrant women or persons who have no money, no status, no residence, that they fall victim. And yes, they do. They're also a very vulnerable group. But the girls between 12 and 17 in any country are also a very vulnerable group to become a victim of trafficking. And if you do not count them, then you fall short of your monitoring, and also you lose the opportunity for prevention, because it's very, very hard to have any prevention schemes for other countries. If I look at the countries that victims of trafficking come from, in the Bahamas, from Haiti, Chinese Republic, Cuba, it's hard for the Bahamas to have any preventive schemes in place for them not to become a victim. But if it's about girls in your own country, then you should look at it from a much closer perspective. For instance, sexual violence, children who have been victim of sexual abuse or sexual violence are much more prone to become victims of trafficking. And of course, if, say, 2 or 3 boys exploit 2 or 3 16-year-old girls and have them have sex with their friends for some money, that's trafficking, and that should be seen as trafficking. But we very often see that as sexual abuse and do not really put the label of trafficking on it, which means that the trafficking figures that you have can be false, and also the prevention and protection schemes that you have will fall short to protect these girls. I remember I talked with an Austrian colleague of mine about the fact that we had these Dutch girls become victim, and he said, "Oh, no, we don't have that in Austria. Austria is a much too rich country to have those." But that's not true. It's not just about riches or being able to go to good schools. It can be, for instance, a result of sexting and blackmail, the way that it starts. So there's a lot of different ways to to fall victim to trafficking, and no country is immune to that. No girl between, well, I'm now saying 12 and 16, we even see them as young as 10 and 11, which is horrifying, and we don't really, of course, we don't want to see that. But I think that the fact that you do count them, do see them, will help you to prevent it. And yes, it's important to prevent women who come from other countries to be sex trafficked into your country, but it is just as important to see your own nationals as possible victim or vulnerable for trafficking. And of course, when you hear the word trafficking, you tend to think that it should be across borders, but it's not. It's if you look at the wording in the Palermo Protocol, and I do think that the definition of trafficking that all the countries, well, most of the countries have complied to should be the same that we use in the CEDAW Convention. So the legal way of describing what is trafficking is defined for all, well, for the whole world by the Palermo Protocol. The other recommendation by TIP was, by the TIP report, was the monitoring system. Now, Marion already said that I was the Dutch rapporteur on human trafficking, and I've been that from 2006 till 2017. And well, my role was, well, I could do within that role what I wanted to, so to speak. My role was to report on the scale and nature of human trafficking, and of course that's a very wide description. And so we saw that the way we did that, and we found, of course, with the data collecting was a very important part of it, but the awareness raising was important. And on all, I was, maybe I should say that first, I was an independent rapporteur, and being independent means that you well, are hold up a mirror for your government and tell them what they're doing wrong. And of course, the independence makes it easier to say things that the government doesn't really like. I remember that I was not the first. I had a predecessor, but the Netherlands was the first to have an independent rapporteur. And I remember that Romania wanted to have an independent rapporteur as well. And we really helped them to set that up. And then the government fell in Romania, and so did the rapporteur. Well, that's not independence. Independent means that you stay on if the government changes, and that you cannot be sacked for saying things that the government doesn't really like. I had about 80% of my recommendations over the years have been adopted, which I think is quite a good number. If all my 200 recommendations would have been adopted, I would not have been strict enough, I would say. But some of the recommendations were only adopted years and years after I had given them, and some of them have been adopted and then got lost again. Some of the recommendations I did in the early age were the training of judges. I come from the judiciary myself, and I know that judges do not really like to be trained because they have the feeling they know it all, but they don't. And so in the beginning, it was me who trained many of the judges till it became sort of, well, normalized, and then people from my staff did the same thing, and then it became a part of the education for judges when they wanted to do big criminal cases. And I will tell you, this is a sort of an anecdote. I had given that same recommendation 3 times. And the first time the judiciary said, interesting, and didn't do anything. And the second time they said, interesting, and didn't really do anything. And the third time I had looked at the judicial, all the jurisprudence of a couple of years on trafficking, and not only had I looked at the outcome, or what were the problems that judges would face, but I had also noted the judges that were part. We have a 3 judges court on these cases, but I also noted the judges that were part of these court proceedings, and I found that about 70% of them had only done one of these cases in the last couple of years. And of course, if you need, well, let's say heart surgery, you would like a doctor who does that a little more often than once a year. Now, I blackmailed the judiciary also a little bit, I can confess here. And I said, well, the news can be that you have decided, I said that before coming out with my report, that you as a judiciary have decided to start training judges. The news can also be that judges are not really so well versed in this complex matter. You can sort of guess what the answer was, and I was content with that. And in the end, so were the judges, because it's a complex matter. It's really difficult. It's difficult because of all the facts that there are, and it's also difficult because the jurisprudence on trafficking is, well, there's not really that much on it. It had to be made, and that was also about the time that the first judgments from the European Court in Strasbourg came, and that also helped many of the judicial systems within Europe. So if we look at the types of trafficking, we see, of course, foremost prostitution, sex trafficking. That is one of the types of trafficking that is, well, that happens a lot. And of course, that is the type of trafficking that is predominant in Article 6 of the CEDAW Convention. And still, it's not the only sector or the only field that women or girls are trafficked into. So we really should look at a wider perspective for trafficking for women and girls than just prostitution and sex trafficking. I've seen that prostitution in the Bahamas is legal, but it's not seen as work. And there's a lot of sex trafficking, known sex trafficking into the Bahamas for exotic dancing or sexual services. Now, I don't think any country in the whole world has really dealt with the very, very complex problem on how to deal with prostitution. Personally, I don't think the Netherlands has done the best job there is, and I think it is wise to keep talking about this, not in a way that's how do you say that, too self-confident, because I don't really believe in the fact that there would be one perfect way to deal with it. So for instance, if it's legal, but it's not seen as work, how do these sex workers, how are they protected? Can they open a bank account, for instance? And if you don't see it as work, what are the ways to help these sex workers not to be dependent on traffickers or others? I couldn't find if buying sex from a minor is considered as a criminal offense. It is in the Netherlands. I tried to find that in the Bahamas, but maybe you can tell me later. I see here that prostitution in the Bahamas is not legal. Well, on Wikipedia, it said it is. So this would be a discussion, and maybe I'm sure, Marion, that you know best. So maybe that should be changed there. What I saw in Wikipedia, but please tell me if that's right, that earning money from prostitution is not legal and it's not seen as work, but buying sex or selling sex by itself is legal. Is that true or not true? This is what I found on Wikipedia. Marion?
So I'm trying to access the actual legal article,
Okay.
but as far as I know, to this date, prostitution, buying, selling is not legal in the Bahamas, and you can be arrested and charged for it, and it happens, not frequently. I mean, a blind eye is often turned, but yes, you can be charged with prostitution, buying and selling.
Okay, well, I stand corrected. I have my information from Wikipedia. In the Netherlands, it is legal. And of course, those countries where it's not legal, and specifically our General Recommendation 38, finds that where prostitution is legalized or licensed, prone to licensing, that those countries foster the demand on trafficking. I do not really agree with that. That's because of my background in the Netherlands, but I do see that prostitution by itself is a very, there's a lot of trafficking going on in prostitution, and how to deal with that is a difficult question, because a lot of people come from other countries into the Bahamas. This is also my Wikipedia knowledge, and also the knowledge from the tip report, for exotic dancing, and then falsely used in sex clubs or brothels. They're not coming into the country specifically for prostitution, but they are coming for other reasons and are then sexually exploited. Now, we saw in the European Court on Human Rights in Strasbourg, there was a case called Rantsev. There was a Russian woman, a young woman, who got a visa for Cyprus, and who went to Cyprus thinking she would become a dancer in Cyprus. And the number of dancing visa for Cyprus you would think that all the ballet companies of the world were stationed in Cyprus. So those that gave the visa turned a blind eye, so to speak. This girl, Rantseva, came into Cyprus and was forced to work in a sex club, and she didn't want that. And of course, if she didn't want that and didn't comply, she wouldn't earn money. And so the owner of that sex club, well, he tried to force her, and then she ran away. She ran away, and she came to, she went to the police. And the police saw that the person who had helped her get the visa, her supporter, or that he was the owner of the sex club. So they said, well, this man is responsible for you. And they called him to come and fetch her. And I've seen in the tip report that when somebody is a supporter for somebody coming to work for him, that there needs to be a letter of release to be able to work somewhere else. Anyway, this girl, Ranseva, told the police that she didn't want to go with this man, and that she and that she was forced there to work in the sex club. But the police didn't really listen to her, and they sent her back with this same man. And the next morning, she was found dead on the pavement, maybe pushed, maybe she jumped. That story doesn't really tell, but she was dead. And of course, that was a terrible end for her. But I think what's really interesting here was that her father, Ramsev, a Russian citizen, sued both Cyprus and Russia for not abiding with the Warsaw Convention and the Palermo Protocol and human rights in general, Article 4 of the Convention on Human Rights. And the court agreed with him, and they said, and there this was an important for all government officials. They said that all government officials have a duty to identify victims of trafficking, look for signs, and it's not just the police, it's also the council or anyone working for the government should be able to and should be trained to see the signs of trafficking. And I think that was a really a landmark decision of the European Court. And there the Rancev judgment has really altered the way that many of the European countries have looked at their role and their responsibility in identifying victims. And of course, identifying victims is the first step to protect them and to prosecute those who traffic women and girls. I remember there was around that time, there was a train in the Netherlands coming from the south of the Netherlands, and there were two young women with a bag, and in that bag there was a lot of fancy underwear, and somebody else had their tickets, and this man, this railroad official who looked at their tickets thought, I don't really believe that this is going well. These people will get out of the train in Utrecht, and I think these girls are not here by their own free will. So he called the railroad police in Utrecht and said, this is what they look like, and they will get off at the Utrecht station. And yes, this man and these two girls were, the man was apprehended and the girls were given shelter. And I think that this was really fantastic of this man in the train seeing this. And this is something that we should all work for, because it's all around us. If we look at the demand that we look at in the in Article 6 and in the General Recommendation 38, we also have to look on the demand for cheap labor, because it's not just sex trafficking, it's also labor trafficking, where women and girls are used as cheap labor and exploited. And of course, there's a difference between the way of exploitation, whether it's sex exploitation or labor exploitation. There's a more force needed to be able to convict on labor exploitation. But if we look at the demand side there, one of the things that I used to say is, if you buy mushrooms in the supermarket, we are now completely trained into seeing whether they are biologically grown and healthy and whatever. But we should also pay attention to how do they come here, who picked them, how can these be 98 cents for a box of mushrooms, how can that be in the shop, and maybe we should look at that closer. Now, the ordinary customer in the supermarket cannot, in my opinion, cannot be held accountable for buying those mushrooms, but they can help in not wanting to buy mushrooms that are too cheap. And like we do in the clothes industry, that of course there's been a huge cry out for the clothes factory in Bangladesh, where many people were killed. But we also what we also see is that we need to get factories and companies to look at their whole supply chain and see how the stuff that they sell has been made. In some countries, there is a legal obligation for the huge companies. Not in the Netherlands yet. There is a sort of gentleman's agreement that the supply chain should be looked at. And of course, companies like Nike, well, there's the outcry, Nike or other very well-known big companies, they do not want to use child labor or because that's bad for their brand. Maybe also because they don't think it's a good thing to do. I should hope so. But there are ways to make companies look at their whole supply chain. Now, for the huge companies, that kind of works, that kind of in place. It's the smaller companies that pose a difficulty in complying with with looking at their whole supply chain, that there's no child labor or other labor exploitation involved. One of the other tip recommendations, that I talked about earlier, was the letter of release. And again, I'm quoting the tip report here. That if somebody works, when somebody works in the Bahamas and has been supported by one employer and he comes from abroad and he is exploited and wants to work somewhere else, he needs this letter of release. And I think that is something that really that prohibits victims of trafficking who are in a very bad situation to change employers or have a way out of their situation. Coming back to the CEDAW Convention and GR 38, prostitution, demand, migration are the key words in the GR 38. And yes, that's very important, because migration makes women and girls vulnerable. We see that, for instance, in the Netherlands, 14-year-old Syrian girls married to somebody of 35 or 40. That's a way to exploitation within a marriage, or maybe even a forced marriage. So we face that kind of problems, and one should be aware of that. But there are also other groups of women and girls that are vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. And a couple of years ago, I tried to look at a few other perspectives, and also perspectives that affect girls. And one of the things that I saw is anorexia, the eating disorder. There are a lot of anorexia ANA coaches online. Girls with eating disorders will go online, and they can be, and those are very often, well, the nationals of the country themselves. They can very easily become a victim of trafficking and sexual exploitation. We see that also with LGBT young persons who don't really know what they want yet and go online, that there are predators online who will exploit them. And we see children exploited within the family, very often families that have migrated, officially migrated to your country. We see that in the Netherlands with Moroccan families, that they get a family member who still lives in Morocco to do the housework in the Netherlands, and can do so for years and years and never be noticed. And of course, they are only noticed if we look at that as a problem. And I think the awareness raising is really one of the most important things that we can say again and again and again. People should know about it, should understand it, and should also know that they can have a role themselves in it. One of the examples that I talked about in many conferences was a Moroccan girl who was exploited, I think, for about 6 or 7 years in the family by her uncle's family in the Netherlands. And she came there when she was about 8. And she was brought from Morocco to take care of one of the children of this uncle who had a handicap, who was handicapped, disabled. The general practitioner would come into that house very often. Nobody wondered, why doesn't this girl go to school? There were other persons who came into this family and saw that this girl was there working all the time and not being, well, I mean, if you are 8 or 9 or 10, you should be in school during daytime. And the fact that nobody felt the need to wave a flag, to see the alarming situation, was because they didn't really think of it as a possibility. And there too, the awareness raising is a very important part of the fight against trafficking. I hope I have given you some sort of overview. I can see a lot in the chat, but I do not really see a question, but maybe I'm looking at, I'm talking too much to really see it. So please, if you have any question, please ask them.
Thank you so much, Corinne, for giving us this really grounded understanding of the article. I think a lot of times we read them and they seem sort of very hypothetical or very theoretical. So it's great to have those real examples. So I guess I'm going to move away a little bit from the actual examples to talk more about the way that the article itself is written. So my Yes, it's a couple of questions, but really I'm wondering what you think about trafficking being coupled with exploitation of prostitution in one article. Do you think that it lends to people believing that the only form of trafficking or the only form of trafficking being addressed is in this space of prostitution, but also why the use of the word prostitution? I know that the convention was written a long time ago, but has the committee made moves away from that word, particularly since we're talking about sex work and we're talking about it as a profession, an area of work that women actually choose now? Are there conversations happening about the terminology?
Not really, and I would like there to be more conversation, and when there is a conversation, I'm usually the one to start it. But that's also because of my background and the country I worked in. I think trafficking in Article 6 is all forms of trafficking, because trafficking should be read as it is defined in the Palermo Protocol, and that means that it's also labor trafficking. I think that that is a very important part. If I look at exploitation, exploitation has different meanings. It means forcing, and it also means earning money by it. And I know that in the Netherlands, exploitation has a much more liberal, what would we call that? It's not as if it's vague, but it's not there's no connotation to it. Exploitation just means earning money from it. It doesn't mean forcing anybody to it. That's the way that we see the word exploitation. That's different. And of course, some of us see it more as exploitation of prostitution, that all forms of prostitution are trafficking. I do not agree with that. And I know I agree with practically all that's written in General Recommendation 38, as I should as a member, although it was issued before I became a member. I think that sometimes, I think that I do think that you should call it sex work. That I agree. I have just been on a task force to advise the municipality of Utrecht on how to deal with their sex works. And one of the things that I've advised them is try and find out on a small scale what would work best. I do not believe that we can eradicate sex work completely. I just don't believe that that's true. That doesn't mean that you can't set up norms for it or standards for it, because for the Netherlands, people often think that everything is allowed here. It isn't. It's you need license. There is the police will look into it if you and it also means, because it's not forbidden, that, well, it's not forbidden in all places. So the police will look at the situation at a much more intense way, and sometimes victims can tell the police what's happening to them. But I'm not saying that even in a controlled area like the red light district in Amsterdam, there's also trafficking. So it's, but I think that if you say that trafficking and prostitution is sort of the same word, that you, well, I don't agree with that, because if you look at it in such a way, there's a chance that you really fight prostitution and don't see the trafficking that is behind it. And I think that it's the trafficking that we should fight. And so I think that the debate on trafficking or on prostitution should be kind of separate.
Mhm. Yes. If I could just respond to Corinne, thank you very much for your position and the Netherlands, etc. In terms of the regularization and legalization of sex work in the Netherlands. And I just want to respond a bit to what Alicia has asked about the committee. So, and how we work with the issue of sex work and etc. So in the committee, there is no consensus to date. And I've been on the committee now for 6 years. And there's no consensus around this issue of sex work and prostitution. Over the years, we've had several NGOs who represent NGOs that engage women who engage in sex work in different parts of the world. And they've made very strident and, in my view, convincing and persuasive arguments for the CEDAW Committee to move forward with this issue of sex work and the protection of the rights of sex workers. We have not done that as yet. So to date, it's still an ongoing conversation in the committee. And the way that we address it, and I'm looking directly at the concluding observations of the Bahamas, where the committee over 2 constructive dialogues, we appeared before them in 2012 and again in 2018, they've asked in both concluding observations that we decriminalize women in prostitution. It's right here, I'm reading it. But we decriminalize women in prostitution. So prostitution, sex work in the Bahamas is not legal. I put up the Section 8 of the Sexual Offences Act.
Well, thank you. And excuse me, please.
That's okay, Corinne. Wikipedia sometimes doesn't get it right. and I have relied on Wikipedia myself. So in big bold black letters, the CEDAW Committee is saying to the Bahamas as recently as 2018 to decriminalize prostitution, because yes, the committee is very clear that the criminalization of prostitution is discriminatory. Yeah. So that's where we have the consensus, Alicia. But we do not go as far as to say legalize or regulate sex work in the different countries. Decriminalize is as far as we get in terms of sex work and prostitution. Does that respond somewhat to your question, Alicia?
Yes, and also, I guess just for clarity, are you saying that it's not then recognized as work?
No.
Correct.
And I remember, I think it was South Africa that we had the constructive dialogue with a few sessions ago. Yes. And there the Supreme Court ruled that women who were working in a brothel, whereas prostitution was not legal in South Africa, but nevertheless the Supreme Court ruled that the workers in a brothel, no matter whether it was legal or not, had towards their employer had the rights that employees can rely on versus their employers, and Supreme Court called it sex work. And that is, I think, one of the very few concluding observations where the word sex worker or sex work was used as opposed to prostitution. And I do like the word sex work better, because it does more right to those women who work there.
Thank you. Those who are joining us, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute and ask your questions or make comments. You can also use the chat if you like. We're keeping an eye there. If you have anything, we'll give you some time to think about it. Corinne, earlier you said that exploitation is taken to mean that you're making money from it. So when you look at exploitation under Article 6, are you looking specifically at people who are controlling people who are engaged in, or people who are engaged in prostitution, receiving funds, or does that also count for a person receiving funds for themselves?
I think that in the in the original convention that the word exploitation does have the more neutral connotation. But I think that reading it together with General Recommendation 38, that the connotation has become less neutral.
Okay, and I encourage everyone to read the general recommendation as well as the protocol that was mentioned. The link is in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, it will be in the description, because I think the definition is really helpful, particularly the part that says about vulnerability. So it's not just about coercion or abduction, but also abuse of power or a position of vulnerability of a person. And about the general recommendation, I think a couple have come up in previous sessions, but we haven't talked about how they come about or how they are used in combination with the convention itself. So could you give us a sense of how General Recommendation 38 is used alongside Article 6 and why a general recommendation was necessary here?
General Recommendation 38 is a new one. It's our latest one. So it's not really, there's not many examples yet of how it has been used, but it is being used also in our judgments in individual communications. We look at it also because it is explanatory to Article 6. But I'm very interested in when the Netherlands will be, and also Austria will have their constructive dialogues with the committee, because they have legalized and regulated prostitution. I think that we will have to see that. We can't really see it as yet and of course all general recommendations are part of our list of issues, of our concluding observations. They're part of how we see a country, but there will be so it is part of it, but we haven't really come up against a country that is very much against what is decided or what's in General Recommendation 38. And I'm very interested in how this will go, because the demand side, that is really a big part of 38, is something that has been asked even before 38 was in place.
So Corinne, what are the factors that increase or push the demand for traffickers to traffic in women and girls in particular? What are the social and or political and or other factors that really impact this increase?
Well, maybe I can give you an example of the Netherlands. 1/3 of the victims in the Netherlands, 40% of the victims in the Netherlands are Dutch, and over half of those are underage girls. Now, buying sex from under 18-year-olds is a criminal offense that can be prosecuted and with a prison sentence of up to 4 years. So that's really quite a crime to commit. And yet, the fact that that is criminalized in such a way does not help in any way that these girls become less, the number of these girls decrease, not in the least. So that this also, if you look at that part in any country and you see that as trafficking as well, then it becomes clearer that that you need to do a lot more than forbid it, to really curb it, to control it, to diminish it or eradicate it. I think that in the Netherlands, the ban on brothels, lifting the ban on brothels, was at the same time as the opening of the EU borders. So a lot of people from poorer countries like Slovakia or Bulgaria, Romania came to the Netherlands for sex work, and of course this was a coincidence, so to speak. But the fact that you could, as a Bulgarian trafficker, just go up to Amsterdam and rent a few windows for victims to be trafficked in, made it easy for them. That's why we had in the beginning, we saw taking somebody over the border to work in to sell sex, to work as a sex worker by itself, with no coercion, no vulnerability, even if it's just, oh, I can give you a lift. When somebody questioned, and even from people who were sex workers in Romania and asked somebody to give them a lift to the Netherlands, that was seen as trafficking and punished also as trafficking. So what we've seen is that I think the influx of women from Eastern Europe, that was a result also of the lifting of the ban on brothels. Mm-hmm. But it could very well be, and of course we don't know because we had lifted the ban on brothels, that they would have come anyway, because they also went to, I don't know, Germany, Sweden, or the other Scandinavian countries. They went everywhere to find an income, and also a lot of girls from those countries were promised, well, we would say golden hills in the Netherlands, if they would follow this one man, and there were stories about, we'll get married and we'll start a life together. And that's, that was like the prince on the white horse, and they would follow him and would then work in prostitution. That happened in all the richer countries. When we look at persons from the poorer countries within the EU. So I do think it was easier. But that's not the only, that was not the only reason. Mostly it was poverty and seeing a possibility to sell sex and then earn from it there. For instance, we also have quite a large group of women from South America who come to the Netherlands on a 3 months visa, work in a red light district somewhere in the Netherlands, and then go back. They are not trafficked. They keep their own money, and that's the way they keep their families. So there's so many different forms of sex work, and the demand can be for specifically pregnant women, or for 12-year-olds, or so demand is a really it's a complex issue, and it's hard. So if you look at demand, we see that we know globally that having been a victim of sexual abuse as a child is definitely a sign, or, well, how do you see it? Well, can lead to being more vulnerable to sex trafficking later on. So it's such a complex problem. There's not really one answer, I would say. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry.
That's fine. Thank you. Thank you for that. I just have 2 short questions, please, Alicia. Corinne, what I'd like to know, if often on the committee, we ask countries to set up national action plans around trafficking in persons, trafficking in women and girls. And just briefly, what might a gender sensitive or gender responsive national action plan look like? That's, you know, just some sort of brief elements of that. And then two, an NGO like Equality Bahamas, how can NGOs intervene and contribute and be productive in this arena of trafficking in women and girls?
Well, I think one of the very important things is the specific shelters for women who are victims of trafficking. In many countries, these victims will be sheltered together with women who are victims of domestic violence, whereas there are different they have different problems, and those that have been sexually exploited, sometimes shame is part of the problems they have, and what we see for specifically younger women, that they go back to their trafficker, specifically if they've been trafficked for over a longer period and have a bond with this trafficker, however sick that bond may be, they will go back. They have calculated they'll go back something like 10 times before they're really out of this system. Now, if you do not have a specific knowledge about how these women and girls are somehow, how difficult it is to weaken that bond and to get them to help themselves and to accept the help that you as an organization will give them. If you have no real knowledge about that, you would say, okay, after the third time, well, you know, I'm done with you. You don't want our help. We're not helping you. Whereas specifically that tenure, that persistent helping is really very important. So yes, I think NGOs can really ask for this specific shelters for victims of trafficking, and I think that that's really important. And then also, if I look at the visa, because you very often need a visa to come into the Bahamas, I think officials who hand out these visa should look at the reason they're given for. Like I explained this Ramsef case, that's really, and there too, the gender specific side of that is that they're very often visas given for female work, like exotic dancing, and I think that those that give a handout those visas should be much more aware of that and not give that visa. So the protection and prevent, these are on protection and on prevention. And one of the things that I've seen also in the Netherlands, when I look at the judgments in these cases, it's hard if the victim agrees to be victimized. That doesn't mean anything. That's of no relation to the crime of trafficking. So if a girl says, "Okay, I will do that under vulnerable circumstances," maybe she thinks she's in love with the trafficker. And judges had a hard time understanding that. And I think that there too is a huge gender perspective also.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you.
Corinne, I'm just looking at the concluding observations from the CEDAW Committee in 2018 to the Bahamas. And I guess the big note there is the concern about the low number of cases that have been taken to the court.
Yeah.
So the recommendations that have been made, and I'll put them in the chat for everyone, are really around building capacity of the judiciary, like you talked about, as well as law enforcement officers, healthcare professionals, social workers, There's also the recommendation to conduct a study to really get a baseline on the extent of trafficking in women. And these are things that you have talked about and that I'm really curious about. I find that many times we see recommendations and we wonder, when is the government going to do this? Like, it needs to do this. We don't know that it will. And many times NGOs end up stepping up and trying to put some of these things in action. Do you have any tips for us if we were to look at or encourage other NGOs to look at doing this baseline study, how we could get started, how we would be able to do that, not being government institutions and necessarily having access to the information that the government may or may not have collected?
Well, like I said earlier, data collection is a very, very important part. And I should think that those data should be available for everybody. So that would be first thing. Monitoring is also a good thing. And maybe even if it's not independent, but if a national action plan would foresee in a monitoring mechanism, even if it's a government official, that will lead to more data and more statistic evidence of what's happening. I do think that training for judges is an important one also. And one of the things that I've recommended, and that is maybe not really for the government, that could be something that NGOs can do. Victims are very often afraid of the police, but they will speak to a doctor. So I have recommended to have human trafficking as part of the training for doctors also. And sometimes when victims get pregnant and they need an abortion, they don't want that, but their trafficker wants them to have the abortion. Those doctors too should understand, and they should also have a sort of telephone number or someone they can call to help them. When a woman comes to the doctor accompanied by somebody who seems to intimidate her, that's a sign that maybe she's trafficked. So training for doctors would maybe be easier for NGOs to get done, to get realized, than it is to get the government to do that.
Can I ask one more question? One more question, please.
Sure.
Thank you. I know we're coming to almost to the end of our time. Corinne, I'm really interested in the issue of victims of trafficking, women and girls, and the issue of reparations. How does the committee and how do we deal with this issue of reparations? So, for example, if I'm sexually exploited for a year, I mean, day after day, what is the response to that in terms of monetary reparations, psychosocial services kinds of reparations? I guess what I'm really driving at is that the traffickers would have made a hell of a lot of money from me for a year. So shouldn't I be compensated, at least monetarily, with some of that money that may have been gotten through tracing and forfeiture by various entities? How does it work?
Well, absolutely, you're right, and that does happen in the Netherlands. Sometimes it's kind of strange, because if you add up what a victim has earned for the trafficker, it can be quite a lot. And I think the largest sum that has been allocated was about €1 million, which is for the Dutch, for the Netherlands, that's really a very large sum of reparation. Now, if this victim gets that $1 million, of course, normally in many countries, it would be the trafficker who has to repay that. We have a system where the government pays the victim that sum and then gets the money from the trafficker or any other criminal. Now, then there's this young woman who has €1 million on her bank account and is immediately again a victim of getting that money, because that's money furnished by the government. So this can sometimes be a difficult issue, but if you talk about reparation, there's definitely, and also in the EU directive, that's also a name there should be a sizable reparation. We have very often lawyers here who help victims have a sort of standard of €1 per day, for instance, which is it's not at all enough, but it's an easy sum for when somebody has been to work for a year to sum up how much money that would be. Oh.
All right. Well, I think people have lots to think about and question for themselves. Thank you so much, Corinne. This has been really, really helpful, really useful for us in terms of, thinking more about these issues and how they're framed and what we can do and what we should be encouraging our government to do.
Yes.
Really, really appreciate you being here with us. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Well, thank you for organizing this, and it's been really a pleasure to talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And everyone joining, our next session in the CEDAW Convention Speaker Series will be held on November 5th. So that's a Saturday, a little bit more than a month away, November 5th at the same time. So that's 10 a.m. the Bahamas time. And we will be joined by another CEDAW committee member, Nicole Ameline, and we'll be looking at Articles 7 and 8, which are focused on political and public life and on representation. So this will be really interesting for us, particularly as we've just coming up on the 1-year mark since the last general election. And there was much celebration last year about having more women in Parliament than we've seen for a little while, and really having the chance to think about what representation looks like, and maybe even talk about going beyond the numbers and thinking about quality of leadership and the women that we really need to see, feminist women, women who believe in women's rights, and how we can get more of them in more seats. So really looking forward to that conversation. That link will be available in the next 20 minutes. So you'll be able to register at tiny.cc/CEDAW7. It's tiny.cc/CEDAW7. In the next few minutes, you'll be able to register for that session. Stay tuned to Equality Bahamas and what we have going on. As you know, we've been working on the criminalization of marital rape with the Strike 5 campaign. We attended a consultation about a week ago, and we will be sharing more information about that in the days to come, as well as what we need to do moving forward to ensure that the government does not delay on this any longer, and that we strengthen the bill and get it passed expeditiously. Thank you once again for joining us, everyone, and we're looking forward to seeing you on November 5th for the next session.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.